The $11 billion self-help industry has long been criticized for its lack of regulations and responsibility. One of the most popular gurus at this time was able to charge $9,000 for a retreat that would end in death for 3 guests. As survivors testified at this trial, more information emerged about what really happened in that tent.
And there was many people lying around. Everyone was unconscious.
Yet after a conviction and a prison sentence, this guru is back in business, and now on YouTube.
The detective told me that they were investigating it as a homicide, and I was already in shock. I called my lawyer, and my lawyer said, "Get out of there."
You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke Makenna. In today's case, we're going to dive into a deadly retreat where many were paying lots of money just to change their lives. And we're also going to dive into just how shady this business can be. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, PDS Debt. PDS Debt provides you with a match for your debt solutions tailored personally to your financial situation. Anyone with $10,000 or more in eligible debt qualifies with no minimum credit score. You can get a free debt analysis right now in 30 seconds at pdsdebt.com/Brooke. That's pdsdebt.com/Brooke. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 2009 and everybody knew this motivational speaker, this self-help teacher. He had written a book called Harmonic Health, The Secret of Attracting the Life You Want. Many went to him looking for a new perspective on life, a way to change their life. He was widely known due to his work on a documentary called The Secret, which was based on the best-selling book. The Secret taught humans all over the world the law of attraction and the power of positive thinking, and he was one of the philosophers that was speaking on this topic. In essence, it was saying that you can create the life that you deserve. It was revolutionary to many, some believing it as their new religion. But James Arthur Ray went on this documentary and he gained quite a lot of notoriety from it. In fact, he was asked on The Oprah Show on Larry King, and many loved his charismatic, happy, bubbly attitude.
Change your life. James Ray, dedicated to teaching individuals to create wealth in all areas of their lives.
James Arthur Ray, author of The Science of Success.
You got to feel it and you got to act on it.
So his book then hit the New York Times bestseller list, and he went on the road to preach his message.
One of the greatest masters of all time said, if you knew how hard I worked to develop my mastery, it wouldn't seem so wonderful at all.
His delivery to any room was said to be charismatic and powerful, and he began to rapidly gain followers, from some offering testimonies that they had already worked with him and that they had completely changed their lives.
The science we're going to talk about tonight is very, very sexy. Energy flows where attention goes. When you shift your attention, that world that you've created collapses and a new world emerges forth. Your mind. It sets you apart from every other entity on this planet. How are you using it? 3 for 3. Your thoughts, feelings, and actions all must be firing in alignment. Let me tell you something. Some people come up to me and go, oh my God, I watched The Secret and I'm just sitting in my living room meditating my millions into my lap.
He was said to tick all of the boxes as far as spiritual, financial, and wellness self-help all in one, which was something that a lot of the self-help gurus at this time were lacking. They would have one subject, but James Arthur Ray was speaking on all of them. And many of his conferences would provide challenges to the guests that would become more and more difficult, but it made these guests feel powerful when they would do it, such as having to crack a board in half.
Every single thing, from a pine tree to a Porsche to your body, is comprised of 99.99999% what? Energy. Beautiful. And so is your house energy. No or yes? Is your money energy? No or yes? Yes. Your money is nothing more than the amount of energy, paper energy, that you have in your pocket or purse. Now, you see, what we need to do is realign our thinking around currency or energy or money, because many of us have been conditioned to believe that it's not spiritual to want to have a big fat wad in your pocket.
In May of 2009, a woman named Kirby Brown went to James Arthur Ray's Harmonic Wealth Weekend, which was to promote his book, but she paid $1,300 to go to this. She was a 38-year-old decorative painter and surfer who lived in Cabo San Lucas, Mexico. She had traveled all the way to California after reading his book and being inspired, and while there, she would be offered to attend a 5-day spiritual warrior workshop in Arizona. Most guests had to go through different levels of James Arthur Arthur Ray's workshops and lessons before they could get to the spiritual warrior, which was at the top. However, at this retreat, James went ahead and offered it to all of the guests. If they wanted to go and skip ahead all those levels, they were able to do so. Now, Kirby had not gone through all of those levels. It cost about $20,000 to do so. So she was at this Harmonic Wealth weekend, and James Ray was offering for her to sign up. So she decided to do so. She was informed that this 5-day retreat would be held in October in Sedona, Arizona, and for the travel and the accommodation, it would be around $9,700. Now, Kirby was said to be an artist, a free spirit, a strong individual who was always working really hard on herself and always had a smile on her face, no matter what. So Kirby decided to take a chance on herself and attend this retreat, but she would have never guessed a program to restart her life would end her life instead. Now, there was some known about this popular self-help guru, James Ray. He was raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the son of a minister. He grew up in poverty, said his family really couldn't even afford haircuts. He dropped out of junior college and got a job as a telemarketer at AT&T. He then began to study quantum physics. He studied with a Peruvian shaman, Amazonian witch doctors. He was getting all the information that he could. He was reading lots of self-empowerment books. He went to a Tony Robbins seminar, and he realized that this is what he wanted to do. He was also said to fall into a very deep depression around this time, and he wandered around a desert for 10 days. He allegedly then found himself in the cave where Moses was said to find himself receiving the 10 Commandments. This is where James said it all came together for him. His work on harmonic wealth, quantum physics that he had studied for the past decade, it started to take form. But he said that the secret in being in that documentary was what really changed his life, because out of all of the people in that documentary, he was one of 4 to go on these talk shows. By 2009, his company was making $10 million a year, and he was planning on becoming the first new age billionaire. But 5 months after Kirby had signed up for this retreat, on October 3rd, she was in Angel Valley at their retreat on 70 acres of high desert land. Now, she had first met with a woman named Beverly Bunn, who was there for the same retreat. She knew this because when she had signed up back at that Harmonic Wealth weekend, this woman had signed up with her. So they had met up once again, and they decided to actually room together. They felt comfortable with each other, and they were greeted by James's team, which was referred to as the Dream Team, who were there to help all of the guests. And one of them was holding a pair of scissors and actually asked every single guest to show their commitment to the transformation by shaving their head. Both women refused at this time. 56 people were said to pay the nearly $10,000 for this retreat, and they were heading in there being told that they were not allowed to talk to James Ray unless they were told they could do so, and if they saw him driving by in his golf cart, they weren't allowed to say hello either. The first 2 days were said to be full days of lectures by James, along with some clips of the movie The Last Samurai, where an American had to embrace the culture of the samurai in Japan. The third day, they would play the samurai game, which is something that James had allegedly created. He played God wearing a white robe and a gold belt, and the rules were that you could not talk to God. If you did, he would kill you, which meant you had to lie on the ground for hours until he decided the game was over. Now, during this game, Kirby allegedly needed to use the restroom, and so she had asked James, if she could go. And James proceeded to yell, "Die, die, die," until she finally fell to the ground and laid still. She was there for several hours, still having to use the restroom, and she was so desperate she felt like she could puke.
He enjoyed playing God. You have to picture him in the samurai game dressed in a white robe, pointing to people. When they say he said to die, no, I mean a booming voice pointing at you saying die. And if you didn't drop instantly, he really started screaming at you to die.
When it was finally over at midnight, the guests were then taken to the desert for a vision quest. Now, this was said to be a Native American tradition, and that's something that James would often do, is use Native American traditions and kind of put his own spin on them. But this would happen in the desert, where each person would have 10 feet around them they could not move out of, they could not eat, they could not drink for 36 hours. And all that they had was a sleeping bag, although they could buy a poncho for $250. After those 36 hours in the desert alone, 2 nights, they were allowed to return to the retreat for the final day. They were given this big meal in the morning, and at this point, 40 out of the 56 guests had chosen to shave their heads heads as part of this process. Beverly, Kirby's roommate, decided that she would do the same, and so she went to tell James that she was going to do this. She was so happy and proud of herself. She thought James would be as well. However, she said she told James this, and he snapped at her that he didn't give an F what she did. Now, the last night on October 8th, they would all be placed into a small tent-like area, which was described as a sweat lodge, another Native American tradition. This is like a sauna, and water is actually poured over hot stones that are in this tiny tent, and the room is filled with steam. These individuals were said to be shoulder to shoulder, crammed in there, and this was supposed to be the most intense part of the retreat yet. James told the guests that they were going to feel like they were going to die, and that they would see that as a true spiritual warrior, they had conquered death, and therefore they had no fear and no enemies in this lifetime or the next, because the greatest fear that they would ever experience is the fear of death. He said that they would have to get to the point where they would surrender, and that it's okay to die. Now, of course, all of the guests there did not take this literally. It was supposed to be a rebirth, a transformation of sorts. And so Beverly went inside and became worried immediately that she would suffocate because there was no ventilation anywhere in this tiny tent covered in blankets. There was 56 people, almost 60 people inside, and this was a 5-foot tall, 24 feet wide tent with only one exit. Each round was around 15 minutes, and by the end of the first one, a man started staggering about. By the fourth round, many began to ask to leave, and James kept telling them that they could get through this. It was mind over matter, and to ignore what their bodies were telling them. The fifth round ended with a man falling into the hot stones and actually burning his arm so terribly, but he was just staring off into the distance as though he didn't realize what was happening. Some people were throwing up, others were falling unconscious, some were said to be in this trance, and Beverly noticed that Kirby, her roommate, was not breathing or moving. As chaos erupted inside of the tent and people began to panic, it was said that James shouted that he was in charge, that the door was closed, and then the next round had begun, and they were not allowed to leave except for in between rounds. So there were 3 more rounds, and inside of this tent, it was said to be a full 2 hours of this. Finally, they were allowed to leave, but many were unconscious and being drug outside, and others were foaming at the mouth. Many of the guests could not talk, they could not walk, their motor skills were gone. Some had eyes rolled back in their head, mucus coming out of their nose and mouths. One woman had gone crazy and was having to be held down as she screamed, "James Ray, I want to F James Ray. James, why did this happen? James, I love you. I want to F you." As a nurse, Beverly Bunn was running around helping as many people as she could, and that's when she realized that inside of the tent, Kirby, her roommate, was getting CPR. And so was a guest named James Shore, who was a 40-year-old father of 3 who worked at an internet company. They were both laying there foaming at the mouths and turning purple. Beverly looked over and James Ray was standing next to them, and Beverly allegedly saw no emotion from him. He just stood there not helping anyone.
We're both unconscious, no pulse and no breathing.
All right, you there by yourself?
No, there's a lot of people here.
911 was called, and not soon enough, paramedics did arrive. They asked what happened, and when they were told this was a sweat lodge, one of them actually claimed that everyone there was an effing idiot. Helicopters were called in. 19 people were taken to the hospital with injuries. They were all being diagnosed with heat exhaustion, some with kidney failure, and even with treatment, Kirby Brown and James Shore would die that day. Their autopsies determined their cause of death to be heat stroke. As the injured were being airlifted, the sheriff's department arrived around 6 p.m. asking for James. Sergeant Roz Diskin saw many women with shaved heads walking around in a daze, and he thought this was some kind of cult. Other officers thought that this was some kind of mass suicide. Then Sergeant Frank Barbero, who was looking for James, was told that he was at the main building eating dinner. When they found James, he refused to answer any questions from the police nor the survivors at the retreat. And the next morning, he took the first flight out of Arizona back to his home in California. Meanwhile, another guest, Liz Newman, who had been airlifted as well and who was in a coma, she was a mother of 3 and she died after 9 days in a coma. Her cause of death was multi-system organ failure due to hyperthermia due to the prolonged sweat lodge exposure. She wasn't just a regular guest either. She had done multiple of these retreats with James and was part of the dream team that was actually helping to encourage the other guests. But the retreat was now over and the surviving guests were traumatized. And while guests headed back home, the Yavapai County Sheriff's Department began an investigation.
After about the fourth round, 2 participants were dragged to the door by the people attending the sweat lodge. It is believed that the entire sweat lodge lasted for 8 rounds.
The only ventilation was the door, the one entrance and exit, when it was open.
They found that this sweat lodge structure had been constructed by a local group right before the retreat, and there was no record of a permit or application for a permit to build this. And where was James Ray when they were doing this investigation? Well, he was back on the road preaching.
You're an orthodontist. You've had extensive medical training. Was there a point at which during this ceremony in the sweat lodge you thought, this isn't right? There are people in here who are really sick.
Yes. If the door was closed, you couldn't leave. If the door was open, you could leave. At the 5th round, someone was passed out and she was taken out. At the 6th round, they'd said that she was passed out. She isn't breathing. But they yelled it out and stuff, and by the time that they had actually said that and announced it, the door was closed. No one can leave when the door is closed. The door is now closed, this round has begun, and we will deal with that at the end of this round. I started to look around. There were many people lying around who were not conscious. I saw people with mucus coming out of their nose. I saw mucus coming out of their mouth. I saw eyeballs rolled back in their heads. I was bringing dry towels and blankets and things to them. I tried to pair people up so that they would actually coach people to breathe, talk to them, try to make them alert, call out their names. Once I got people paired up in one team, I would go to another team. Then I went to another team, and then I went to another person. I called out his name, and he opened his eyes, and his eyeballs, blood red, all the blood vessels had burst in his eyeballs. And I paired him up with another person, and I started to look for Kirby. Kirby was my roommate. I started to look for Kirby because I actually started getting a little bit scared. Then I looked across the tent and I could see actually through the door and through the other side of the tent, and I could see them do chest compressions on Kirby.
Kirby died.
That's when I told one of the dream team participants, one of the dream team people, I told them about 10 times. I said, I'm a doctor. I said, I know CPR. Right. I know CPR. I can help. I knew that those people were getting tired because by the time that happened, they had probably been doing chest compressions for at least 15 minutes.
A search warrant was then granted for James' offices in California. They were looking for medical records of the guests and information on previous sweat lodge incidents. It was also found that a retreat back in 2005 that James led, a guest had fallen unconscious and the paramedics had to be called. Now, 5 days after the deaths, James actually called Kirby's parents and said it was the most awful thing that he had ever had happen to him in his life. He sent them a check for $5,000, not even the full amount that she paid to be there, but he said it was simply out of the kindness of his heart. However, it was in hopes that they would use this money and it would become a legal settlement of sorts that they could not sue him. However, they chose not to use any of his money. And about a week after the deaths, James did hold a conference call for the survivors. Now, this statement and the whole call was exposed to the media and the transcript was leaked. So as they began the conference call, James Arthur Ray said, I really wanted to be with you all on the final night, and my thoughts were consistently with everyone who was having challenges. I just kept thinking I had to take care of my people. He says, as restless as your mind might be, take 15 to 20 minutes to slow down and remember who you are. Next, it's important to surround yourself with healthy, harmonic-minded individuals who support you and love you. Hopefully, you'll connect with support, and if you haven't, please do, because this community is coming together like never before. I'm sending blank to all of you who took ill, and also those that transitioned and left this physical life. You can only give what you have, and you can't give what you're not. Again, let's all remind each other of what we know. He said, now is the time to rise above the mood and use what you know. It's okay to grieve. I feel grief, but in the midst of what you have to do, the things that will keep you healthy and that are best for every one of our family members who are still ill or deceased. We all know the power of prayer. Studies prove it. Let's have a moment of silence for those who have taken ill and for those in recovery and for those that are family members of those who transitioned. A moment of silence to do what we will to send our brightest intentions and love to those involved, including ourselves. Then a woman named Barb, who was one of James Ray's staff members, goes on to talk about the two that had passed at this point, who were James Shore and Kirby Brown. And she said they left their bodies during the ceremony and had so much fun they chose not to come back. And that was their choice that they made. James Ray then ends the call by saying, I love you guys with all my heart. I've thought about each and every one of you, the families, nonstop. I would have loved to have been with you that night. Thank you so much for who you are and what you were doing for each other and the world. Highest prayers for the families and those taken ill and a speedy recovery. Love you lots. And that is when he began to get a lot of hate. And so James would get very defensive on his Facebook, saying people are throwing out accusations and disparaging me and our mission. Yet despite that and despite considerable criticism, I have chosen to continue with my work. It's too important not to. One of the lessons I teach is that you have to confront and embrace adversity and learn and grow from it. I promise you I'm doing a lot of learning and growing.
I was abandoned, as well as everybody else was abandoned on this situation. It was a crisis situation. It was like a total triage situation. There was like many people lying around. Everyone was unconscious, and he abandoned us.
No explanation, no apology.
No, nothing. We were told that we went to the dinner hall. We were in the dinner hall by 6:30 that night. About 11:30 that night, we were told that Kirby and James had passed away and that Liz and Sydney were in critical condition. Many others were taken to the hospital. We were trying to do a head count, and we never saw James Ray ever again, and he's never contacted any one of us. He's not contacted any one of us again, but he doesn't know what some of us are going through.
Now, on October 15th, the sheriff's office declared this as a homicide investigation. 15 days later, Liz Newman, James Shore, and Kirby Brown's families filed a lawsuit, a wrongful death lawsuit, claiming negligence, negligent misrepresentation, and fraud against Ray and the site owners. Two other guests who were survivors, Sydney Spencer and Dennis Maraver, were also a part of this. Sydney's lawyers claimed that James tricked these people into his death trap for financial gain. But the Angel Valley Retreat owner, Amira Hamilton, said that there was nothing wrong with the lodge itself and that her center had no part in how James ran the ceremony.
He told me not to call 911. I said I'll do it anyway.
But it began to be evident that James Arthur Ray was not who he claimed to be, and the lies began to unravel. Many of the people that James claimed to have studied with to become this ultimate self-help guru, they were claiming this wasn't true. The Peruvian shaman that he had mentioned was actually a tour guide instead. His childhood friends said that his family wasn't even in poverty when they were young. So many were beginning to wonder if any part of his journey was actually true. In January of 2010, the New York Magazine interviewed James and asked, "What did you do after making sure 911 was called?" He said, "I did everything I could to help. There was a medical doctor there and I was having her make sure that everything was being run appropriately. I held people's hands, I stroked their hair, I talked to them, I held IV for the paramedics. I was there the entire time doing whatever I could to help until I was detained by the detectives." He was then asked, "Why didn't you speak to the Spiritual Warrior Retreat participants before you left?" And he said, "I asked on several occasions when I was being detained if I could possibly go speak to them, and that just wasn't possible. The detectives were doing their jobs." But on February 3rd of 2010, James Arthur Ray was arrested and charged with 3 counts of manslaughter, and his bond was set at $5 million. However, his lawyer argued that he couldn't afford this, and so his bail was reduced to $525,000, and then he made this bail. His lawyer said this was a terrible accident, but it was an accident, not a criminal act. night. 3 of the victims' lawsuits were actually settled prior to his criminal trial for more than $3 million.
My daughter did not choose to go unconscious in a tent in an event that Mr. Ray ran. Does he still not realize that it was too damn hot?
When you killed Liz, you killed the best friend you ever had, and you were so easily impressed by yourself and all that glitters that you could not even recognize it, much less appreciate it. There was nothing you could teach Liz, James, or Kirby about honor, integrity, and impeccability. But they could have taught you a lot. They were born spiritual warriors, and you are not worthy to spit shine their combat boots.
James Shore's wife and kids, they received $1.38 million. Liz's family received $1 million, and Kirby's family received $860,000. James didn't pay this though. The insurers did. But he also faced a wrongful death lawsuit that had been filed by a woman's family who had committed suicide at one of his events. There was another lawsuit against him by the owners of the Angel Valley Retreat Center. James's trial for manslaughter began on May 1st of 2011, and his defense began to claim that these deaths and illnesses may have actually been caused by an organophosphate or a poison used to kill rats that was used at the Angel Valley Retreat.
Mr. Ray didn't force anyone to go into the sweat lodge. Mr. Ray didn't force anyone to stay in the sweat lodge.
One of the guests, a man named Scott Barat, said that he did everything on his own accord. There wasn't any pressure to play full on, to not give up, and that they knew what they were getting into. So this is where the testimonies began. And so Melinda Martin was an employee of James' company, and she said she performed CPR on Kirby Brown at the sweat lodge. But after this, she had to leave her job because James didn't even reach out and tell her thank you for all of the help that she provided. She felt like he just threw her aside, and she actually went on to do an interview where she exposed a lot about that night.
Paramedics arrived and they came. The guy's like, what happened here? Is this like a mass suicide? He said to me. And I said, no, it was a sweat lodge gone wrong.
You work for the man, but you're not allowed to talk to him.
Right.
What was the reason for this?
James was on a pedestal. And he lived in Beverly Hills, and he very, very rarely came to the office. And when he would come to the office, he was very quiet. After the first round, when the door opened and people came out, I was shocked. I was shocked at the condition of the people that came out. A girl comes out and she was hysterical. She was crying, telling me, this is bad, I don't like this, I want to go back to the way I was, please, please, I don't like this is bad. I had another guy come out, and he was screaming at the top of his lungs, I don't want to die. Please don't let me die. Please, please save me. I'm dying. He was screaming so loud, and that's when I was looking at him, and I'm looking around like this, and I'm doing everything I can to put water on people to bring the heat down. Now I was dealing with people in trances and saying they were dying, and their arm's skin was gone. I mean, fallen into a pit of molten rocks, and he had burned his entire arm, and all the white of his skin was gone, and the skin was just basically hanging off of his elbow. So down his leg, down both sides of his arms, and he was sitting there staring, not reacting to the burned arm, and I was trying to take care of him. And his entire mindset was getting back into there. He said, I'm not done. I've got to go back in. I said, no, you don't have to go back in. You've done it. You're okay. No, no, no. This is wrong. I've got to go. Why did this happen? Why am I here? I need to go back.
Martin says at this point she wanted to call 911, but she says Ray's staffers told her no.
And they told me that that wasn't something that would be done because in the past 911 had been called, and James got very, very angry at the person who called 911. So that had already been squashed. So I was in the mode of taking care of people. And they told me, Melinda, get the look off of your face because you're scaring people. You're going to make people think this isn't normal. I mean, people were being dragged out right in front of James. All I know is it was quickly becoming like a MASH unit. People were vomiting, projectile vomiting everywhere. People were laying in vomit, and they didn't even care because they were suffering so badly. Well, I just happened to be on that side of the tent when James came out. And he came out, and he stretched his arms up, and everybody hosed him off, and he's like, hey, thanks. And his assistant came out, and they just looked amazing. And it really stopped me in my tracks. I just stopped, and I said, How can you walk out of there when all of these people are down and they look near death, and you guys can walk out there looking like you just spent the day in a spa? I'm sure he was shocked, but so was I. But that didn't stop me from getting down on the ground and, working and trying to get people back to life. Called James Ray International when it opened in the morning to try to see if I can find any information on these people. And they answered the phone, "It's an outstanding day at James Ray International." And I said, "No, it is not an outstanding day at James Ray International." And they said, "Why? Just because people took ill in the sweat lodge?"
Took ill?
Took ill in the sweat lodge. I said, "That's what they told you? They took ill?" And she said, "Yes." What happened? It was like they were trying to wipe it off like it didn't happen.
Prosecution was saying that death was a major theme at this retreat, and another guest, Linda, testified that she wasn't in her right mind after this sweat lodge. She had lost consciousness and she was thinking about death. She remembers thinking it was a good day to die, and that's the last thing she remembered.
I could hear a snorting breath sound from, it was Kirby, I later found out.
Survivor Beverly Bunn, who we've talked about in this story, testified that despite her medical training, she didn't automatically help anyone during the sweat lodge because she wasn't the one in charge. James was the expert. He was the one they were there to learn from, and that he was supposed to be the one to take care of this situation. She said that he was not in control of the sweat lodge, and she was just trying to survive it herself. She also said that over the course of the week during the retreat, they had learned that you didn't question James Ray on anything. You knew what the rules were, and things were not optional, and that there were consequences, or you would be reprimanded and called out if you had questioned anything that he had said. Another guest, Stephen Ray, who is not related to James Ray, had fallen into a coma in the sweat lodge. He was in a coma for a few days, and when he came to, doctors were telling him that when he was brought in, they thought it was a mass suicide. The doctors thought it could have also been exposure to poison and not heat stroke, but Stephen did testify that his toxicology tests were negative, although he did lose his sense of taste and smell and still suffers from headaches, insomnia, and memory loss. An employee of the Angel Valley Retreat, Fawn Foster, testified that she was tasked with bringing fresh fruit and water down to the sweat lodge, and she decided to stay and watch because her gut told her to. And so Fawn said that she watched a woman try to leave early, and two members of the Dream Team tried to pull her back inside. Thankfully, they were not successful. The woman was able to leave, but Fawn found this very strange. Fawn said that she had eaten the same fruit, drank the same water, and inhaled the same smoke, and didn't suffer any ill effects, denying that there were any sort of chemicals in the ground or anywhere that could have caused these illnesses. She also claimed that the resort only used salt water to kill weeds, and the only poisons used were placed in crawl spaces and structures at the resort. Although she did say that rat poison was held in the same shed as where the sweat lodge tarps were held as well. But then the jury was informed that Fawn was a convicted felon. She had given a false report to law enforcement a decade prior. So Sergeant Diskin, who was there from the very beginning, testified about the possible chemical exposure. He said that he looked into the reports of treated lumber and took several pieces to the lab for examination. He said that some of the tests were positive for volatiles when burned, including methane and ammonia. But results for that came back the same day that James was indicted, so he couldn't have actually told anybody that prior to that. The sergeant said that later on, the owners brought him in and told him about the rat poison stored in the pump houses, the same houses that the tarps used in the sweat lodge was stored as well. He thought it was very suspicious that they were recreating what this pump house looked like for him after rat poison was mentioned in the trial. Dr. Brent Cutshaw at the Flagstaff Medical Center, where the victims were transported, said they didn't have a clear picture on what had happened, why the victims were there, but they suspected carbon monoxide poisoning early on, though it was then ruled out through testing. Though when he was asked if they could have ruled out the organophosphates, he said he couldn't with certainty. He said that Liz Newman arrived with a high heart rate, low blood pressure, and about 101-degree temperature. She had to be put on dialysis due to kidney failure and remained on a ventilator where she developed a blood clotting disorder and a severe brain injury.
And her eyes are floating back in her head and her face is all bloody, and you know, I just dragged her away out of the doorway because somebody else was coming out behind them throwing up.
Now, a recording made by one of the guests inside of that sweat lodge that day was played for the court, and this heard Ray telling the guests that they had paid to attend this event to become true spiritual warriors, and in their altered state, they would endure heat so intense that it would make them feel like their skin was coming off their bodies, that they were going into this lodge symbolically as if they were going back into the womb of Mother Earth.
Today's the day you put your life on the line and all that you stand for. When you have faced your own death, you stared it in the eyes, and you've overcome it, then life's never the same. It's really just not.
However, it was also heard that Ray mentioned several times to drink plenty of fluids. Now, James Ray did not testify, but he did tweet the entire time quotes from his books. On June 22nd, he was sentenced to 3 two-year terms at Lewis State Prison to run consecutively.
We, the jury, duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled action, and upon our oaths, do find the defendant, James Arthur Ray, on the offense of manslaughter as a result of the death of Kirby Brown as follows: not guilty. Do find the defendant, James Arthur Ray, on the offense of negligent homicide as a result of the death of Kirby Brown as follows: guilty. Offense of negligent homicide as a result of the death of Elizabeth Newman as follows: guilty. On the offense of negligent homicide as a result of the death of James Shore as follows: guilty.
I will never, ever again conduct another sweat lodge.
Though after less than 2 years in prison, 20 months, he was released on probation. After getting out, James would say that he was full of shock and anger, and he blamed God when he was first sent to prison. But he then said, after he was released, that he had been arrogant then, and it was arrogant of him to think that he won't face challenges just because he's doing something good. So, 15 months after his release, he moved to Los Angeles and he began to write a memoir. In 2013, he had an interview with Piers Morgan, and James was asked if he was disgusted by who he was back then. He said he was only human, he had no complaints about the punishment, and that God gave him what he deserved.
Like I said, it's the greatest pain I can imagine is to really care about helping people and end up seeing them getting hurt.
I mean, people who heard you say that earlier reacted quite strongly and said, well, no, the greater pain is to be a relative of somebody who died in your lodge that day.
How many people walked past my daughter in her last moments trying to gasp for breath and didn't help her? How do you live with that? Someone was working to revive her outside the tent, and I don't know that they were even trained to do CPR. How do you live with that?
I'm terribly sorry. It's not easy to live with. You know, it's something I've thought about every single day and will continue to.
Do you feel guilty for what happened?
It was my event. It was my lodge. I designed it, not the lodge. I designed the event. I chose to do the lodge. And to that degree, I'm responsible. I was the captain of the ship. I have to take responsibility for that.
There was an allegation that you left the scene pretty quickly and just disappeared. Is that true? And if so, why did you leave so fast?
You know, Piers, I wish I could say that I was enlightened enough to not have any impulse for self-preservation. I'm not. Within the first 5 minutes, the detective told me that they were investigating it as a homicide, and I was already in shock, and I was like, what? And I called my lawyer, and my lawyer said, get out of there. I told him what the detective said. He said, get out of there. They'd seized my room. There was nowhere to go, and so I left. And again, there's many things I wish, in retrospect, I could do differently. But I was scared.
You see, this is when James Arthur Ray was trying to make a comeback, using his story as a testimony of sorts, that you can get through things. He was putting on smaller seminars. He filmed a documentary called Enlighten Us, which aired on CNN. This was focused on how the tragedy affected him more than anything else. He told an audience, on October 8th, 2009, I was involved in a terrible accident and I lost 3 friends, people I really cared about. He then began making YouTube videos, still preaching his thoughts, and meanwhile, victims' families and survivors were being torn down online, being called crazy and stupid for going to this retreat in the first place.
You cannot impact or change the world until you first impact and change your own world. Your pain is not a signal to suffer. Your pain is a signal to grow. You want to impact the world? You cannot not impact the world.
This infuriated the victims' families and survivors. Obviously, Kirby's mom said that her daughter was cooked to death in that sweat house, that James had left them in the dirt. Yet James was saying that to quit self-help now would be disrespectful to the memory of those who died, that they are heroes, not victims. He said, sure, we were doing something extreme, but extreme athletes in our country are heroes, and I believe Liz, James, and Kirby are heroic as well. James was asked about what he would respond to Kirby's mother, who was his greatest critic.
The unfortunate truth is that my greatest critic, who said her daughter was cooked, was actually estranged from her daughter, and that was one of the reasons her daughter was there, was looking to find clarity around her own life and to live her own life above and beyond what her family, friends, and society had imposed upon her and told her she should do, and that's what everybody was doing, frankly.
But what pushed the victims' families and survivors over the edge happened in 2016 when James filed a motion to restore his civil rights and set aside the judgment of guilt against him. He would regain voting rights, international travel, but most importantly for him, he would have the ability to explain to insurance companies, different companies he was working with, that the court set the conviction aside.
The people that participated, you know, as much as the media has wanted to vilify me or whatever historically for this situation, they participated willfully, and they were told, as you saw in the clip, they were told about the dangers, and so they made a choice, and they did that willfully.
All the victims' families wrote letters to the judge asking him to deny this, and James said, I've served 2 years in custody and paid restitution and complied with all of the laws. I'm applying that same law to get my rights back. I have an unwavering commitment to inspire entrepreneurs to live their best. That's a calling, not a crime. The judge did deny this motion, but Ray was given back his right to vote. And after that, James continued to be on social media and on YouTube, where he has his own video podcast with his wife. 15 years after this tragedy, and he is still teaching.
Listen to me. And listen very, very carefully, because your future depends on it.
Kirby's family has said that now that her voice has been forever silenced, her family will now speak for her, and they actually launched a nonprofit called SEEK, or Self-Help Empowerment Through Education and Knowledge, to educate the public about the self-help industry. They are guiding the self-help community towards a responsible future, and they've challenged motivational speakers to take a pledge of integrity, which is the Seek Safely promise. James Ray has allegedly denied to do so thus far, but I will leave all the website down below. I think what they're doing is amazing, something that hasn't really been thought about or looked into, that these self-help gurus need to also be held accountable for what they're causing. But do you think James Arthur Ray should have been held accountable for these deaths? Was his sentence enough? Should he be allowed to continue his business? I cannot believe that this is a real case and happened to real people, and it is just a scary thought how much power these self-help gurus, motivational speakers can have over people, can make them feel like they're changing their lives, and who knows if it's actually ethical, because there's nothing to regulate it. And make sure you're subscribed with the notification bell on. I upload every single week. Make sure you have watched the latest video, which is a family's TikTok plea for help and the Madeline Kingsbury's disappearance and her case and the upcoming trial. I will have that linked down below. Please go check it out. Don't forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.